Okay, so let me pose to you all this question. Let's say that I have this particular spot exchange rate. This is the rate at which the Mexican peso, the MXN, is trading to the US dollar, the USD. Remember, the one number goes on the bottom. The other currency's number is going to go on the top. One stays on the bottom. My question to you is, if this is the spot exchange rate for the Mexican peso and the Japanese yen versus the USD is 101.75 yen to the dollar. Well, my question is, if you sold something in pesos, so you're a manufacturer, you sold something in pesos, to a buyer in Mexico, but you are a Japanese manufacturer, what's the value of your proceeds in Mexican pesos in terms of Japanese yen? So I would probably think of this as a two-step process. Let's just say you sold something for $1 to kind of keep the math a little bit easier. And so 1 peso is worth, $1 is worth 18.25 pesos. So if we're going to go the other way, 1 peso, we should get something smaller. Like, if we're going to go from dollars to pesos, the number is going to be bigger. But if we're going to go from 1 peso to US dollars, that number is going to be smaller. So that's how I kind of know that if I'm going to go from pesos to dollars, I need to make it smaller. I need to divide that amount. And actually, instead of $1, let's say you sold something for $10,000. Sorry, not $10,000, but 10,000 Mexican pesos. So the machine or whatever that you sold in Mexican pesos. And if you want to convert that first to, if you want to convert that to yen, well, first we need to convert it to dollars. And then we can go from there. So if I'm going to go from pesos to dollars, that number needs to be smaller. I divide it by 18.25 MXN per USD. And that gives me $547.95. Cheap machine. Okay, but this is like step 1 in our 2-step problem. The next step is, I'm a Japanese exporter, sold it in pesos. I need to bring this home. I need to figure out what this is worth in terms of Japanese yen. But fortunately, we know the exchange rate between the US dollar and Japanese yen. And so I'm going to take the same approach. It's like, do I multiply or do I divide? And the answer is, I look at this exchange rate and I say, well, $1 buys me more of this currency. And so if I'm going from dollars, $547.95, to that currency, I'm going to wind up with a bigger number. I'm going to multiply the exchange rate, the Japanese yen, versus my current amount that I'm trying to translate, the exchange rate, the spot rate. And that's going to give me 55,753.92 yen. And so these are my proceeds, 55,000 yen. I sold this machine for 10,000 pesos, and I end up through this kind of 2-step process with 55,000 yen. Now, if I just knew the exchange rate between the Mexican peso and the Japanese yen, I could have just, calculated it directly and made this a one-step process. But in currency markets, you often see things, pretty much everything priced against the US dollar. There are some exceptions, but most of the time, the way you see a currency quoted is it's quoted against the USD. It's like the base currency, but, so if you want to go from one currency to another that's not the USD, you kind of have to do this two-step process. Now, there is another kind of shortcut way to do this, and that's called a cross rate calculation. And if you notice that in both of these exchange rates, the USD is in the denominator and it's $1 each, we can kind of take advantage of that and say, well, if the Mexican peso versus the USD is equal to 18.25 per one USD, I can say, well, the Japanese yen per USD is 101.75 yen per USD. And I just kind of look at this for a minute. And if I notice I divide one by the other, since they both have the denominator of 1, algebraically, those two cancel out. And what that means is that taking a cross rate is pretty easy as long as you're talking about everything in terms of USD with a unit of 1 on the bottom. So my Mexican peso to Japanese yen exchange rate is 18.25 to 101.75. And so the last step is if I'm going to go from 0.1793 Mexican pesos to Japanese yen, I kind of see how I'm going to go there. So if I know I'm trying to get to 55,753, if I take my $10,000 pesos, my proceeds, and divide it by this number, then that's going to give me 55,772 Japanese yen. And so that's the same as you see with the other approach. The difference there, the slight difference is due to rounding shortcuts that I've kind of taken here. But either approach gives you the same result.